Welcome back to our series analyzing the 1990s TV series Sliders. Today we're going to be talking about it. Hennessy's. Don't shake hands with random people just because you're a billionaire now. Damn, too late. Well, I guess while Hennessy's is being quarantined for catching COVID-95, we'll talk about the world we've happened upon. Koki, what's happened to cause this world to be the way it is?
So that's hard to say. One thing that's clear is that many of the medical advancements that we enjoy in our current timeline didn't happen in this one. Antibiotics are completely unknown, and while penicillin gets a lot of attention, it's worth noting that a sulfa drug existed in the 1850s, I believe. And given that aspirin was also completely unknown in this world, or at least got a weird reaction, we can assume that perhaps the Bayer Company, which is responsible for both of these in the German Confederation, might not have formed. Of course, this doesn't necessarily stop penicillin, the named antibiotic they are trying to develop. I don't know if they actually develop in the end. Seems as though the odds are unlikely that you can just happen upon that, but it's within the realm of possibility. That being said, these developments happened in other countries. I believe France and the UK were responsible for antibiotic development since the sulfa drug. That might have happened independent of the sulfa drug. It might not have. Maybe that's what got the ball rolling and we don't actually realize this. It's also possible that there was some kind of Spanish flu type event. It's worth noting the German Confederation was pretty volatile. It wasn't a united country, and there was a lot of discussion happening over what would ultimately happen. Prussia ultimately united it as the German Empire later on, but that wasn't a guarantee. Let's say there's some kind of disease outbreak that leads to a strong sense of paranoia. And I think this is something we need to highlight about this world, is that it's a highly paranoid world. When people so much as talk about being sick, like Arturo when he was asking for aspirin, there's a recoil, there's a very concerned reaction. When someone's coughing, they call 911, and this can be seen as maybe the cue is just that terrible. But the Quinn of this world mentions explicitly that there were quarantine zones before the queue started. So whatever kind of event might have happened that gave the medical organizations, at least in the US, a lot of power. There was also a class element to this as well. They mentioned the rich living in sanitary conditions and the poor being sent off to these sort of quarantine zones. The rest of the poor just kind of live in these areas where they're likely to get sick. So, I'm going to straight up and say it. This world is a right-wing fantasy. We saw this sort of paranoia regarding medical establishments in our own timeline with the COVID-19 outbreak. What's interesting about this world is that there was also some advancements in medicine that we don't have in this world. They didn't have a lot of advancements. They don't have aspirin. They don't have antibiotics. They don't have the kind of pill and capsule form of medicine that we have, but all of this might be the product of those initial gains by the Bayer Company and possibly other medical establishments. In fact, even surgery might be further behind because if there's a risk of infection, you're less likely to cut open your patients, right? Now, what they do have is a device that's able to detect the Q specifically in a person, and they're pretty confident in this machine. When the machine says the Q's not detected in Quinn, who they believed was infected, the senior doctor guy is like, let me try that, and he doesn't say, oh, the machine might have malfunctioned. Granted, this isn't quite as impressive when you think they're the ones that invented the disease, but they also seem to have some sort of disinfecting radiation thing. Like when they enter the restaurant, something goes off and it seems to blast their clothes with some kind of disinfecting radiation. And it seems as though contact with the clothes and skin is how this disease is transmitted. And they even show a smaller device that can do this in the infomercial later on in the show. So they have a strong grasp of germ theory. It's just that aspect of medicine developed a lot more whereas other aspects of medicine, particularly antibiotics, the establishment of capsules, and things of that nature, are much further behind. And so I would assume that in the German Confederation, either due to some sort of civil conflict or even just naturally, some terrible disease broke out that caused a huge shift in this world's society.
Before we get to my part, I do have things I'd have questions or want to note. Koki might engage this part as well. Firstly, the guy who saved Wade from being squashed dislikes her kissing him. His being outraged doesn't seem to make much sense from the perspective of, like, disease control, since he already has the Q.
As I mentioned before, this seems to be a very paranoid world. He could be in denial that he has the Q, even though he clearly has yellow skin. And even if he has the Q, it might be socially wise to act like you don't want to get infected. I suppose it's also worth asking, why is it an expectation that this person appreciates being kissed on the cheek by Wade? Rembrandt goes even further to refer to the place as Cycleville, and Arturo brings up, oh, this is a world where people don't want to be kissed by pretty girls. This episode is a little weird about gender. Later on, when Wade is clearly sick and Rembrandt is trying to pass it off as, he says hangover, I think he means drunk, where he's like, you're a man of the world, you understand, some women can't hold their beer. And it kind of goes into a bit more of the pure ideology of this show, where it's not really the thesis of the episode, it's not even something that needs to be explained, it's just, of course you want Wade to kiss you on the cheek. Of course it makes sense to appeal to someone's machismo and play it off as women not being able to hold their beer. It's just kind of taken for granted.
Continuing, Rembrandt gets money and offers to buy food at the very outset, as though they didn't just recently get in severe trouble and roped into a civil war for merely having the wrong kind of money on a world. This does kind of go into another question about the series as a whole, like why is their primary money-making system conning their doppelgangers and using that money on other Earths? Using it on the same one, yeah, it seems reasonable, but on others would be risky.
Well, it did go catastrophically the one time. It's worth noting that in the Michael Mallory world, as well as the oil world, the same money was being circulated as their own timeline. So yes, it's risky, and maybe they should have acknowledged the risk. It's like, if they take this kind of money, dinner's on me, or lunch is on me, sure, there could have been some kind of acknowledgement, but I do understand why they would feel mostly safe, because most of the worlds, especially if Quinn told them about the Elvis world, seem to use regular currency, what we see as regular currency.
So from an in-world explanation, why would they have 0 wanted posters for cue ball in the restaurant itself and about 60 in the restroom? And then just an aside, the reward is noted as $1 million, and in modern money that would be about $2 million.
I'd say that generally this restaurant has, in big, bold letters, clean. It wants to give off the impression of being a sterile environment. And I know wanted posters may not necessarily look diseased, but it might look like clutter. Now, the question is, why do they accept it in the bathroom? Well, that's not really their storefront, that's not really their advertising. Though I'm also going to say it doesn't seem like this restaurant cares too much about their image. It might just be a matter of actual government policy. It's unclear.
I like how when cue ball is shot with a trank, he doesn't just immediately fall over like whoomph, or land on it, like most shows show people doing. This is another world where Pavel is a taxi driver, and I think this clearly points out that there are things that can remain relatively consistent between worlds. These tend to be things like him as a taxi driver, Canada's the opposite of the US, the hotel owner, whose name I forget, Diggs is a bar owner in LA, Ross J. Kelly's a lawyer, Rembrandt's a singer, cue ball's a genius, and Benish is just counterculture.
It's also worth noting Australia tends to be the rival of the United States in a lot of timelines, which is kind of weird, because that's definitely not something in our own timeline.
Yeah, Arturo says we're from different Earths, different immunities, in response to this world's cue ball being surprised as to how fast the Q has advanced. He, in this case Arturo, clearly misunderstands how the immune system seems to work and differs, even given only shown content, as Remy is still seemingly unaffected. Diseases affect everyone somewhat differently, with outliers on both ends. Things can be super deadly, and people can also just be naturally immune.
I do think it's nice that they pick up on this in a future episode. I believe her name is Maggie, that she comes to where they believe to be Earth Prime, and Quinn is perfectly fine breathing, but Maggie seems to collapse sick. I'm not saying they do this consistently or that this is something that necessarily makes sense, but it is a part of the broader universe that they revisit, and I think it's kind of cool that they set it up and they actually bring it back.
And then the last one, the professor makes penicillin and tries to drink it. This World's Cube will ask him why him and not somebody else. This is an interesting medical ethics question that we could talk about a smidge in a later video. Then getting into my actual things that aren't just side notes. A lot of things specifically we can point to real world examples, specifically based on what's happened with COVID-19. Oops. But there are also prior examples to pull from as well, notably like the Spanish flu and the Black Death. First thing I want to note is the food they receive. They get vacuum-sealed burgers, and there's nothing else to choose from. It's what everyone else in the facility is eating at the time as well. I'd find it highly unrealistic, especially for a world that's concerned with health to the degree that this one is. Meat is generally less healthy than vegan or vegetarian options, and that's not even getting into the health problems caused by factory farming. We engage in it not because it's healthy, but because it tastes good and there's a degree of cultural significance. I feel like this restaurant must be one that's being poorly managed, and it's probably not a typical version of a restaurant, especially supported both by the statement of the waitress that there's objectively better food served by other businesses within the borders of the US, and the fact that the coughing guy is tackled and he's tossed into desserts that were in the exact same business. She blames the CHC, but I feel like it's clearly poor management. That's the problem. Maybe intentionally, and they're blaming their bad choices on the government to excuse why they're acting this way. There is a track record in our world of businesses blaming the government for something that upsets customers that can't actually be explained by the government intervention. They use some government mandate, however contrived, to cut expenses or increase prices and say it's not greed on their end, but big government that's hurting the people. This is generally a known problem with libertarianism, assuming businesses are only capable of decisions that harm others because of the fault of government intervention and not because it's financially beneficial to harm others, or businesses don't have an incentive in their model to actively harm customers economically and blame it on big government, regardless of the validity, to push forward an agenda of removing all government protection laws. The depiction here, I feel, is so bold-faced. It reads less as an accurate depiction of government intervention and more like a satire of libertarianism. Even though it's only shown for a small second, there is commentary also on the nature of religion has in health epidemics. The New Church of Divine Immunity is shown. It suggests that there's an equivalent to Christian Scientists or faith healing groups, places that claim they can heal you with nothing but prayer and faith. It entices congregants to come and give them money whilst having hundreds of people who want to go into close proximity with others and be allowed to in the name of freedom of religion, even though it's provable that when precautions are not taken, such systems only pass diseases on quicker and make them more deadly. It's shown by the fact that the church was quarantined, indicating a major spreading cause area, which is in line with what would be expected and what has actually happened. It shows saying that these people are charlatans and their claims should be taken as con artistry.
I think it's worth noting, well, yes, this is something that's definitely a bad aspect of religion. I feel like this episode shows another side to things as well, where nuns are involved in treating the sick when the government just wants them to die in these kind of quarantine zones. And we can even see this alternate Quinn saying, if you're lying, you'll wear that around your neck on Judgment Day. It's not my place to tell you you're lying or to be skeptical. I don't have time for that. So there is an interesting role that religion plays. And while not religion specifically, it's worth noting that the supernatural seems to exist, at least in this world. When Wade has the Q, she seems psychically connected to other people with the Q. She's drawn to them, and while she sees Arturo and Rembrandt as these kind of gnarled, ugly-looking creatures, when she sees people who are infected, she says, "These are my friends." It's not really addressed beyond that. I like the fact that the pharmacy that we see seems to have these kinds of medieval remedies, which makes me think, hey, magic exists, people are working with tree roots and tree bark and stuff. Maybe this is just a witch world, but unfortunately that's not actually explored.
That actually leads into the next thing I was gonna say. The pharmacy, I think, would have been a good place for Wade to have gone to display her knowledges. They're really downplayed and ignored through most of the series.
Actually, I'm glad that you brought up Wade and the pharmacy, because Arturo commits a massive faux pas. First, he grabs a pamphlet about the Q, and then he asks for aspirin, which is a name based on the chemical components of this drug that apparently aren't known about. It's possible that this does exist and it was just suppressed. It seems like this is the kind of medical establishment that would do that kind of thing. But when he talks about having a headache, admitting to it, he's coming off as a bit of a crazy person, and there's a disease that makes people hallucinate. Maybe if Wade were there, she could say willow bark, which was used as a painkiller and is the main ingredient for aspirin and has been for used to treat pain for hundreds, if not thousands of years. I don't know the exact date.
Wade is shown in other episodes to be like very into the occult and anything associated around it, and so showing her as having this kind of expertise in herbalism would be interesting.
I'm also wondering if it's possible that she has ESP rather than the Q psychically linking people, because we don't see Arturo or Rembrandt having any kind of psychic experiences when having this disease. Is there anything in any other episode that gives you a hint or a reason to believe that Wade might have special powers?
There's a couple of episodes, but those usually involve worlds where people are psychic, so I'm not entirely sure. And in terms of this world, Rembrandt and Arturo never get to the jaundice stage.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. And while I'd say that it's possible that aspirin is just something that's kept from the general public, and it's worth noting this is a very paranoid world, so having medicine would create an environment where people admit that they're sick, which is a big no-no, and you'll end up in a quarantine zone. So I could see this is another way medicine could be set further back in different ways because of the one way that it's been set back. Antibiotics almost certainly actually don't exist, though, because Quinn, who was a medical student, had never heard of them.
Interestingly, Arturo dismisses the Berkeley alternative medicine system as one where, quote, any big business medicine was described as a fascist tool of immuno-oppression. I say it's interesting because what he describes dismissively actually seems like it's what the message of the episode's about. The world's medicine is being said to be for the wealthy and so expensive only the super rich can obtain it. The sick in this world end up lucking upon a cure and are opposed to big medicine. I was doing air quotes. Having it because, much like in our timeline, it would be obscenely expensive and the poor would have to die of preventable diseases because it's better for shareholders if the cure is expensive. Q is a metaphor for the state of healthcare, CHC being like the symbol of CEOs of pharmaceutical companies. Hundreds of examples I could point to, but most notably is the price of insulin, where it's always more expensive in countries that have privatized their healthcare systems instead of having it nationalized or highly regulated. That it is a high up in the CHC represents only the corruption of the health department being bought by big businesses, and that this is what needs to be fought. Doctors who do what they can for the sick, even at the expense of hospital or their own profession, are suggested as being incredibly rare, as they risk their licenses, practice, and even their freedom by violating laws in order to help those who need it at no profit. These are upheld as the pinnacle of the medical institution. Outlawing helping the sick or those who want or need surgery won't save anybody. It just causes more people to die, especially notable with the destruction of abortion rights as recently. Rembrandt says, we aren't in America, but they very much are. Just not what America should be. This feels kind of like a minarchist world. What happens when medicine is ruled by a single corporation? In this case, the corporation has a government-sounding name, but it could be a corporation nonetheless, and a monopolistic one at that. I also comment on some less public comments by libertarians, namely the conspiracy that medical institutions want to retain their customers, so might go about creating diseases that they'll then have to cure to bilk the common person out of their money until they have no more and then they're left to die. Also leans into conspiracies like the official stories shouldn't be trusted, as well as created in a lab stories are reasonable. Also kind of make notes of historical atrocities committed in the name of medicine. I don't want to get too much into it, but it's a clear note about the government doing immoral experimentation on people. I'll show on screen a link to Wikipedia listing inhumane experiments that have been done, usually but not exclusively on racial or sexual minorities. There's a lot of intentionally infected sexually transmitted diseases, things like influenza, warts, plague, etc. Not for the faint of heart. I'm not showing pictures, obviously. Use caution if you're going to go there.
I think it's also worth noting that the head of this organization blatantly threatened to infect the cab driver, and this was seen as a credible threat by the cab driver. So it kind of feeds into this paranoia world. One, like you said, this kind of right-wing fantasy, which I've been kind of hitting at for a while.
Yeah.
But two, in this world where people don't want to admit they're sick, it shows that not only is the medical establishment not trustworthy, but people know that the medical establishment is not trustworthy, which is probably why the first pharmacy we see, which could be a typical pharmacy for this world, is what we would consider alternative medicine.
Yeah, something struck me as interesting and kind of funny was when the Queen of this world tried to give Rembrandt one of his earrings. Rembrandt understandably didn't realize what its significance or utility was and commented that he's a straight arrow. This happens several times throughout the series. Rembrandt, a straight cis guy, but is very accepting of gay and trans people, constantly accepting them, politely rejecting what he perceives to be as advances.
He even said thank you.
Yeah, I don't actually know what Clavant Derrick's position is, but I want to believe he's the same way. This is where it comes explicit one of the things I mentioned in a prior episode as well. Towards the end, Arturo says, biology is what you do when you haven't got the maths for real science, saying biology isn't science, and by extension devaluing the entire field by explicitly saying none of it is real.
This is a recurring joke in 4chan Science Board, actually, that biology isn't science. This also happens with psychology and stuff, but the idea that something as broadly accepted as biology is just fake science is kind of hilarious, and it seems as though some people in physics and other fields like mathematics do feel this way about biology, and it's kind of funny.
And so, last thing then, Koki. How is Puerto Rico doing?
So, the fact that a kiss on the cheek is the venue of infection, at least for Wade, means that Puerto Rico does not bode very well. It is actually a very common greeting for women with each other, as well as between men and women, to kiss each other on the cheek. So it's possible that if the Q hit Puerto Rico got hit really bad. I want to believe, though, that Puerto Rico does better in that the class divide, while Puerto Rico does have a strong class divide, may not be so strong that the medical establishment even bothers with Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico in its entirety might be treated as a quarantine zone. It's worth noting that politically Puerto Ricans have valued universal health care, and this was actually implemented during the 90s, the Tarjeta de Salud. So I wouldn't be surprised if, because Puerto Rico's just written off as a filthy, dirty, poor place where everyone's going to get sick and die, that the Puerto Ricans will show solidarity for one another and actually help each other through the disease. I think it's worth noting, we didn't really talk about how it seems to be transmitted. Wade got hit first because she kissed the sick man on the cheek, and Arturo just kind of like patted the guy on the back or something. So it seems as though physical contact is the venue, which is why being blasted by radiation might be treating the disease. So, you know, you touch the clothes of someone who's infected, and then maybe you like touch your face or something like that. Because Rembrandt, I mean, I understand why he would be so close to Wade, trying to treat her disease, try to help her, but it was perhaps a bit foolish, and he ended up sick afterwards. So that's the main thing that Puerto Rico has going against it, is that Puerto Ricans were very close people, we're very touchy people, we're very let's kiss each other on the cheek kind of people. But I'd like to believe, even though I don't fully know the full nature of the Q, that Puerto Ricans would pull together, and this might be a terrible timeline for Puerto Rico, but Puerto Rico might be better off than California.
So that's it for this world. Like the video if you enjoy medicine, dislike it if you enjoy COVID-19. subscribe if you want to go on more of our journeys with us, and comment about whatever you think about what was said. Guess we'll see you in the next world. Koki, get Hennessy's feet. Mishinewe, chaye.
Jeez.